So this week on SDC with iOS 15, literally just around the corner now, we're talking about how you can use these fantastic new privacy settings to keep your iPhone even more private than it is now. Windows 11 is also not quite as close, but just around the corner, and there are serious cyber threats that have already started. Here we'll tell you what you need to know, and photo screening and looking at through your data to see what might be there has very much been in the news over the last few weeks, and we're talking about what impact that has where iPhone users have Google apps on their phones.
Yeah, so coming later on STC, we'll be looking again at CSAM and Google Photos and what they know about you and where you go, etc., etc. We'll also be looking at Windows 11 and the cybersecurity threat that's already here. And we're talking about vulnerabilities in Google and Facebook. But first, I think Kate's got something to say about iOS 15.
Yes, indeed, we have. iOS 15 is going to be out very soon. We think around the Wednesday, the 15th of September, we're going to be seeing iOS 15 start to launch to people's iPhones. So as we know already, this is coming with a lot of new privacy and security features for iPhones. We had seen ATT coming with iOS 14, and that was really massive in terms of influencing the likes of Facebook and Google to perhaps, or users to help themselves be more private. This is coming with loads of other features. One that we found out about just last week, which is actually an opt-in to advertising from Apple, which I am very happy about, and I think you guys all are too.
Transparency with Apple has been something we've talked about before. Apple is very much peddling the privacy message, but it needs to keep its own house in order. And I know we talked before about, Apple does collect data and what is it doing with that data, and we've talked about things like significant location tracking, all kinds of stuff, and it is good that Apple is it seems to be recognizing that and giving users more control over their data where Apple is concerned now.
Not least because the whole CSAM issue has been such a PR disaster, that they've had to backtrack and say, we'll think again about this.
I think the optics are so bad, and that one of the things we did last week, let's look at what's happened this year, right? So we started this year with WhatsApp trying to force its 2 billion users to accept Facebook terms and conditions. Massive backlash, huge backtrack. Fantastic. A few weeks later, starts to come into the headlines, and we covered it a lot, that Google had secretly enrolled millions of users in a flock trial. So it was tracking users in a different way in Chrome, and without telling them or giving them a proactive opportunity to opt in or out to that trial. Not quite as big a backlash, but a big enough backlash, huge backtrack. Then comes Apple, deciding that it wants to do on-device screening, right? Huge backlash, then we see a backtrack. So there's clearly a theme. Now it's really good because the privacy lobby is getting aligned, and it now has a voice, and it has forced, 3 big techs to change their plans purely for privacy reasons, and nothing else but privacy, which is fantastic if you had a privacy mindset. If you're Apple, though, the optics of you being grouped with Facebook and Google in a privacy backlash backtrack, that has got to be causing jitters in California. So
we're looking now that we know that CSAM isn't coming in iOS 15, or indeed iOS 14.8, which I assume is going to hit us in the few days we've got between now and 15 launch. So what is coming? What should we look out for? And what gives us a good reason to update rather than stay with what we've got?
Yeah, in iOS 15, other than the ads opt-in for Apple, which is great, we've also got a privacy dashboard, which will list the app permissions that you've given to the apps that you use on your phone, how often those permissions are taken by the apps, and when they were taken as well. That's going to evolve later on to include the apps that are tracking you as well, as part of the app tracking transparency feature that we've seen. So this privacy dashboard is pretty cool, and it's just more transparency really across your iPhone. On top of that, we have the updates, as you just mentioned. So iOS 14.8, we think, is going to be coming out at the same time as iOS 15. So if you don't want to update to iOS 15 straight away, then you have a choice. And for the first time, we can actually recommend to people, don't update to iOS 15, but do make sure you do the security updates to iOS 14.8 when that comes out. Because that's not going to be about bugs, that's going to be about your security.
We're talking about having a choice not to update if you don't want to at the minute. And I've been looking at something in Windows 11, which suggests that some users of Windows 11 won't have a choice. They won't be able to update at all. Essentially, Microsoft have said that it is possible to skate round the hardware requirements, both in terms of CPU power and the trusted platform module, the TPM security side of things, and install Windows 11 if you do a clean install from an ISO image or use the media creation tool. But if you do that, in other words, if you have what they call an unsupported Windows 11 installation, then you won't get access to Windows Update. And no access to Windows Update means no access to security updates. I mean, obviously, I'm going to try and get some clarification from Microsoft before I actually write my article for this week. But that seems an incredible thing, a credible move to make. We're going to penalise you for not buying a new computer by not giving you security updates.
This isn't unusual from Microsoft though, is it? I mean, when Microsoft OSs go out of date, it's all about you have to update or you don't get support anymore. I mean, it is, the whole cycle is designed to get people to buy new hardware, isn't it? As it is with all computer makers.
But as Zach says, the optics of it are that whilst Microsoft says this about old, end of life, unsupported versions of its software, it doesn't stick to that. We've seen over and over and over and over again that when something big breaks, they will protect their customers and they issue out of band updates, security updates to software versions that are way over Microsoft 7, Windows 7, XP. You'll see security updates for this. So it makes very little sense to me for Microsoft to be saying, no, you'll get no security updates, when actually we all know that if something big breaks, they're going to cave and give you one anyway.
Yeah, and cyber criminals will always follow the money, won't they? So they're going to go for the big companies, the kind of widely used operating systems. That's just the way it works. So it might be a good idea, talking of these sorts of things, to look at what browser you're using. For example, Chrome is the biggest browser. We're talking about 2 billion users. It isn't even matched by its closest competitor at all. It's just got way, way too much of the browser market. We talked a lot about Chrome before and the alternative to Chrome in terms of if you're an Apple user. So Zach has spoken quite a lot before and written quite a lot about what you use on your iPhone. So if you've got a choice with a browser, use the Safari browser. It's much more secure, but it's much more private as well. But what about kind of other alternatives? What do you use as browsers, for example?
Well, I'm a big fan of DuckDuckGo as a browser, obviously not on the desktop yet, but certainly on the smartphone. And then I have to say that I'm actually a bit of a Chromium fan.
I thought you were going to say Chrome then. I was about to
Oh, yeah, just wait a minute. It doesn't get any better.
I was going to say, have you not read any of my articles, David?
It doesn't get any better. I use Edge.
Yeah, Edge is quite good, isn't it? But the thing is, it is owned by Microsoft. It's just that Edge has got such a smaller share in comparison, and actually, it's got some pretty good security and privacy features, hasn't it?
I think your choice of browser falls under the pragmatic advice on privacy and security, right? I use Apple devices. I use Safari. It's easy. It's stitched in. It's set up nicely. I run a mix. People keep on asking me about this, but I run a mix of a normal browsing window side by side, certainly on the desktop, side by side with a private browsing. Because normal browsing, if you're going back to sites that you've logged into, that you use, just makes life easy. But actually, if you're running searches and you just want to, you don't want all that being logged, then you can run a private browsing. It works perfectly.
Sorry, I just say that was all well and good, but I think with some applications, you do need a Chromium-based browser. That's the only thing I would say, because I use Safari as well. But for some applications, business applications, for example, and some websites, they are going to work better with Chromium just because they are optimized for Chrome. That's just the way it is. So if you have to use a Chromium-based browser, you don't have to use Chrome. That's important to note as well. And then for your own browsing, I mean, yeah, use Safari if you're an Apple user. Why use Internet?
So keeping with the theme of Google, I mean, it's really interesting because we're now in a place where the hyperscale apps kind of have us gripped, and candidly, they're very sticky. It's very hard to move away. And one of the things I've looked at this week, in the light of Apple's CSAM and the backtrack, the one thing we know is Apple is not yet screening users' photos on iCloud. Now, everyone else appears to be doing that, but Apple isn't doing that. Now, my strong suspicion will be when it comes back to the table with its CSAM solution, it will probably have to look at something that's cloud-based, albeit with some Apple, special secret sauce, so it does it in a nice privacy-preserving way. It won't do it the way everyone else is doing it, but I think it will really struggle to sell on-device screening post-backlash. Then you shift to Google Photos, which is the gorilla in the cage when it comes to cloud-based photo applications. And then the question that Apple has now raised, I'm sure it wasn't deliberate, is, well, what kind of screening is taking place? Because Apple threw a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in cloud photo screening. What happens if you get a government request? These platforms have access to all your photos. There's no filtering. So we'll be looking at what the implications are, particularly for Apple users, because they're not tied into the Google ecosystem in the way that Android users are, and whether they should be, whether they need to make a switch.
Backtrack a little bit there, because you mentioned logging just now. Logging has been in the news quite a lot this last week. IP logging, for example, tracking back to your IP address. Proton Mail, which is a secure private email client of choice for so many cybersecurity professionals, amongst others, admitted that it had enabled IP logging for a customer recently because a court order in Switzerland made it do so. Now, that was a bit of a fuss about nothing in some ways, because it's always said, made it quite clear, transparency audits, in its privacy policy, that it doesn't enable logging by default for anybody. However, if a court, law enforcement, provides a legal order requiring it to log, then it will switch that on for that particular customer and log from there on. So what else are we looking at? WhatsApp hack. WhatsApp has been in the news at the moment for potentially not being as private as we think. This
was such a foolish story. So when we've talked about it before, clearly when you run end-to-end encrypted messaging, each end is not encrypted, right? Clearly the message has to decrypt for you to read it, right? And that was clear when Apple talks about filtering photos in iMessage. Obviously that is outside the end-to-end encryption. It's what content goes inside it. So a story ran this week that basically said that WhatsApp could read your end-to-end encrypted messages, and everyone's like, what? This clearly would be the biggest news to hit WhatsApp since it was acquired by Facebook. Nonsense, right? There is a setting in WhatsApp where you can report abusive messages, right? So if somebody is sending you vile content, hatred, violence, threats, you can click a button and report that user to WhatsApp. When you do that, your app will take the last 4 or 5 messages from that user, between you and that user, most probably from that user to you, and it will send them to WhatsApp. And then WhatsApp have teams of reviewers who will review the content, and clearly, if there's a breach, I guess they will contact law enforcement, or they will ban the user who's done it. Completely fine, right? Let's be clear. Online hatred, abuse, bullying, child porn, all these things, child abuse, all these things need to be dealt with. And this is a very sensible way to deal with it.
It really shines a spotlight on what end-to-end encryption actually is, doesn't it? Because it was a complete misunderstanding of what it is. And I mean, even on a quite a basic level, because end-to-end encryption is to secure those messages, like you say, in between.
And misunderstandings are a terrible thing the bane of our life in cybersecurity and privacy related circles. And it's probably a good place to end STC this week, because there's one big misunderstanding that really gets on my nerves, and that is that hackers are evil, hacking is a crime. Hacking is not a crime, cybercrime's a crime. And actually hackers are good for the security environment. They're good for all of us, because hackers actually find the vulnerabilities that leave us open to invasions of our privacy, that lead us open to malware, that leave us open to ransomware attacks.